About 20 years ago, the Indian writer Arundhati Roy published her debut novel, The God of Small Things. It won the ultra-prestigious Man Booker Prize, and it propelled her to international fame. But it wasn't until last year that her second novel came out. That book is called The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. Both of these novels are beautiful, powerful, epic stories. So what did Arundhati Roy do for those 20 years in between, besides working on her latest novel? She used her very significant global platform to fight for justice in causes and with movements around the world. In India, she has been an advocate for the most vulnerable and dehumanized people. She's spent extensive time in Kashmir. She has defended Muslims in India when they've been threatened, attacked, or massacred. And she's published many, many nonfiction books and collections of her speeches, including such titles as Field Notes on Democracy, Listening to Grasshoppers, War Talk, Walking with the Comrades, and The End of Imagination. Most recently, she and the actor John Cusack wrote a book on their meeting with NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden, whom they traveled to see in Moscow with Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg. That book is called Things That Can and Cannot Be Said. Arundhati Roy is going to be coming to the U.S. in May, and she'll be speaking in a number of cities. I'm very proud to call her a friend, and she joins me now from New Delhi. Arundhati, welcome to Intercepted.
Thank you, Jeremy.
And congratulations on your second novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness.
Oh, thank you again.
So I want to begin just by asking you about the dedication. You dedicated this novel to the unconsoled. And I've seen you in the past say that all of us in some way are the unconsoled. But talk about that dedication.
The dedication is to those people who, like the people in the book, don't fit into the categories that the ruling establishment, as well as quite often the radical resistance, put people in, particularly the categories in India, because we are a nation of minority, a nation that is divided into this tiny little fretwork of caste and ethnicity and language, and each is pitted against the other, and yet all serves a pretty ancient hierarchy. In some ways, this is dedicated to everybody, but to everybody who, in some real ways, doesn't fit into that very complex grid that we are asked to fit into and then jump up and down in and even be radical in,
In the reviews that I read of the book, so many of them get wrong the identity of one of your central characters, Anjum. They identify Anjum as a transgender woman, but in fact, Anjum, who was born Aftab, was born with both male and female gender organs. And, I think it would be really interesting if you could sort of explain that character, the reaction of her mother when she's born and realizes that her child is not simply a male in gender.
Her mother, Anjum's mother, Jahanara Begum, when she discovers that about her baby, she goes through a series of reactions. But fundamentally and eventually, the problem for her is that her baby is beyond words in her languages, because Urdu, which is the language that she speaks, genders everything. Chairs, carpets, musical instruments, books, of course, men and women, but everything has a gender except her baby. And so the question the book asks is it possible to live outside of language? Anjum, for example, as a character who people like to often ask me, why did you choose to write about her and describe her as transgender? In fact, she has more than just one identity. She's also born as a Shia Muslim and lives through a time when this is a more dangerous identity in India than being a hijra, which is what is the Urdu word for people like her, And eventually, as you read the book, you see that she gets caught up in the 2002 massacre of Muslims that took place in Gujarat. And she gets caught up because she is a Shia. not because she's a hijra, witnessing the massacre that took place around her, and left alive because the murderers think that to kill a hijra would bring them bad luck. There's a Dalit character whose name used to be Dayachand, who becomes a Muslim because he too witnesses carnage against his own father. So he has the border of caste and religious conversion running through him.
Well, and he takes the name Saddam Hussein.
He takes the name Saddam Hussein because he has a video in his phone which he admires of Saddam Hussein's execution. And he says, even if he was a bastard, I want to be a bastard like him. You know, it's really, I mean, it wasn't something that I planned, but honestly, you know, the sense that we live in a grid here and these characters are all slightly off grid, and through them you shine the light on the grid, you know.
Talk about how your real world experience in Kashmir and the real world experience of your friends and others in Kashmir made its way into this novel.
I mean, The Ministry is not a book where, you know, I had a manifesto that I wanted to write about the battle in Kashmir or about caste or about what is happening in the forests of Bastar. But this is the air we breathe, you know. For me, to avoid all this would be like taking some very complicated yoga position, you know, to try and write where you don't look these things straight in the eye. And for me, this has been my life for the last 20 years, you know. These are not just isolated issues that I'm trying to shed light on, but to me, for Indian intellectuals, for Indian writers to have managed to write for so many years without mentioning caste in any real way, without talking about Kashmir, where every summer hundreds of young people are being blinded by pellets. And all of this is so delicately airbrushed out, and we get our delicate fiction and our sophisticated analysis of identity without mentioning caste, without mentioning Kashmir, the upholding of this nation as the land of Gandhi and yoga and non-violence, when in fact there has not been a single day since August 15, 1947, when India was declared independent, that the Indian army has not been deployed, quote unquote, within its own borders against its own people, whether it was Kashmir, Manipur, Nagaland, Mizoram, Hyderabad, Punjab, Goa, Bastar. You know, it's just a nation that is nailed together by military might, and we try to avoid thinking about it. And when I write fiction, I'm not trying to write subjects. I'm not putting puppets on a page and trying to make them live out some political manifesto of mine, you know, but I'm creating a universe in which I invite people to walk through.
What is the significance of cemeteries in the book, and particularly this cemetery where Anjum builds the guest house?
Anjum, I spoke about, you know, the fact that she survives the massacre in Gujarat, which is, again, of course, a true event where in 2002, more than 1,500 Muslims were just massacred on the streets of the metropolises and towns and cities and villages of Gujarat when Modi, the current prime minister, was chief minister. And then, so Anjum returns from Gujarat to Delhi devastated and unable to live the life she lived all these years. And she moves out of the Khwabgah, the place that she shared with this group of hijras, and she moves into a graveyard where she just lives there like this wild, feral specter, just unmoored grief. And of course, a cemetery or a graveyard in India is usually a Muslim graveyard. As you know, the Hindus don't bury their dead, they cremate their dead. So graveyards have also, in this extreme communalization in which Muslims have been pushed to the bottom of the economic and social chain, you know, they are now denied housing, they've been pushed out of the political arena, they are, you know, lynched on the streets now openly and so on. And And so graveyards have become a kind of ghetto, where people congregate. In the last elections in UP, Modi and the current chief minister made big politics out of the fact that all the graveyards are consuming electricity and water, and these Muslims, in other words. Of course, people like Modi and so on, they belong to an organization called the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is the real political power today, not the BJP. And it's an organization that was started in 1925. And its ideologues, open admirers of Hitler and Mussolini, have openly said in the past that the Muslims of India are like the Jews of Germany. And, in the last elections, they proved to the world and to themselves and to the people of this country that you don't need the Muslim vote. So the Muslims are somehow disenfranchised right now. The Dalits have always been disenfranchised, but now the Dalit vote is being courted, and there's a lot of trouble around that because intrinsically they hate the Dalits too. That is the Hindu caste system. For them, they whatever name you call them.
But now there are millionaire Dalits.
Yeah, but that doesn't
no,
prove
I'm saying
anything,
that. No, I know.
If you actually look at the poorest of the poor, the landless, the jobless, they're all Dalits. And of course, that is how you neutralize someone, create a tiny elite, and then say, look, they are millionaires. And even the millionaires, by the way, will not be accepted in society, They will still be Dalits. But it's a bit like, saying, oh, look, you have Michael Jordan and you have a few millionaire black actors, and therefore there's no racism in America,
Arundhati, part of the reason that I brought up the fact that there are some millionaire Dalits now is sort of because we have a similar phenomena. It's not a direct analog, but it's similar strand that you're describing. I mean, we had Barack Obama, the first black president of the United States, and, the narrative about that in sort of mainstream political circles is, aha, we've shattered this glass ceiling, and now we have a black man as president. And yet you look at the condition that many black people live in this country, particularly with police violence and economic apartheid. And it's like, did it really change anything? You can siphon off certain elites and say this represents a new America. But in reality, the same exact issues are facing the very people from black communities, Native American communities, undocumented immigrant communities, and on and on.
Yes, I mean, the fact is that it applies to, having a woman prime minister and so on as well. The same story about, does that change anything for women? There is something to be said when something like that happens, but does it change anything on the ground, or has it changed anything on the ground is a big question. I won't say that nothing at all has ever changed in India on the question of caste, because we are talking about people who used to be forced to walk backwards and sweep away their footprints, or hang pots around their necks so that the spit wouldn't pollute the ground. My heart broke the other day because you read about a young Dalit boy who was beaten to death because he dared to ride a horse in Gujarat. And to me, he was Saddam Hussein on his horse, and his horse led the funeral procession. He was beaten to death by the upper castes, Every day you have this kind of bludgeoning, lynching, beating. And when you have elections, all you hear about is which caste is going to vote for whom and so on. And then when it comes to actually talking about the horrors that are visited upon people because of their caste, there's a silence. It's very, very complicated. I mean, I've written a little book which was published by Haymarket called The Doctor and the Saint, where it's really about the debate between Dr. Ambedkar, the great Dalit leader at the time of the independence struggle, and Gandhi.
Now, if you read the two papers, you will see how Mr. Gandhi was deceiving the people. In the English paper, he posed himself as an opponent of the caste system and of untouchability, and that he was a Democrat. But if you read a Gujarati magazine, you will see him a more orthodox man. He has been supporting the caste system, the Varnashram Dharma, and all the orthodox dogmas which have kept India down all through ages.
People completely have no idea about what Gandhi's attitudes to caste and race were. You know, that falsification of that story is mind-blowing. Most people know the story of the struggle of Indian independence through Richard Attenborough's film, unfortunately, called Gandhi. That film is a piece of fiction. And through the struggle for independence, Gandhi's greatest antagonist was Dr. Ambedkar.
I met him first, say, in 1929, through the intervention of a friend of mine, common friend, who asked Mr. Gandhi to see me. And so Mr. Gandhi wrote to me saying that he would like to see me. So I went and saw him.
He doesn't even make an appearance in the film. He doesn't even show up there. Gandhi insisted that he was the representative of all untouchables, as Dalits were called then. And the great confrontation between Gandhi and Ambedkar happened in 1930 at the Second Round Table Conference in London, when Ambedkar is arguing for a separate constituency temporarily for Dalits so that they could develop into a political community.
We want untouchability to be abolished, but we also want that we must be given equal opportunities so that we may rise to the level of the other classes. But the other things which are far more important, namely that they should have the same status in the country and that they should have the opportunity to hold high offices so that not only their dignity will rise, but also they will get what I call strategic positions from which they could protect their own people. Mr. Gandhi was totally opposed. Totally opposed.
They are scattered. Every village in India has a small settlement of Dalits outside the village. They can never be a full political constituency. Gandhi went on a hunger fast to the death until that was withdrawn. The idea of a separate electorate, But even when you look at what happened in South Africa, all of us are taught that Gandhi went to South Africa, was thrown off a train, and this was his first political education. And from then on, he started fighting against segregation. This is complete crap. The first battle Gandhi fought in South Africa was to have a separate entrance to the Durban post office because he believed that Indians, who he said were descendants of the Aryans, should not share the same entrance with blacks, who he consistently referred to as Kafirs and savages. He fasted in prison to have separate prisons, separate food. And the satyagraha that he started was not for racial equality. It was to allow Indian tradesmen into the Transvaal to trade. And so the whole story has been completely distorted, which is not to say that Gandhi was not a brilliant politician. I don't want to take anything away from him, but I do want to say that the amount of deceit and intellectual dishonesty that has gone into the construction of this narrative is shameful.
We in the United States and on this show, we've talked a lot about how powerful people and pop culture have sanitized the legacies of people like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks to the point where, I think many people who've studied Martin Luther King's life believe or agree that he would never be invited to his own Martin Luther King Day celebrations today because he was too radical. Talking about your description of Gandhi, who benefited from the creation of that narrative around Gandhi?
The Indian upper caste elite, obviously, because in The Doctor and the Saint, what I call him is the saint of the status quo. It was time for the British to give way to this upper caste elite. Even this whole preaching of nonviolence as the only revolutionary thing. What does it mean? I keep saying, I travel to the forests of central India today, 10 years ago, today, now, all the time. You have tens of thousands of paramilitary forces unleashed in those forests because MOUs had been signed with mining companies. 1,000 paramilitary will go to a village, a Adivasi village, an indigenous people's village, 4 days walk from the main road, surround it, burn it, rape the women, steal the cattle, and go. And then in the television studios, when these people have reacted militantly, violently, with the commandos and guerrilla forces, in the studios, they'll start calling them terrorists. I said, what should those people do, you tell me? Should they go on a hunger strike? They're already starving. Should they boycott foreign goods? They don't have any goods. They don't have an audience to do any sort of non-violent satyagraha. You need a sympathetic audience. You need a superstar. Honestly, Jeremy, if you go traveling to India, through the poorest places of India, you will not find a picture of Mahatma Gandhi in any poor person's house. You will find a picture of Ambedkar. Gandhi will be in the government local collector's house or in the government office or whatever. But you will not find it in a poor person's house,
As I was preparing to talk to you, I was remembering you and I met back in 2004 at this time when the streets of, you were in New York and the streets were sort of around the clock filled with protesters who had come from really around the world on the occasion of the Republican National Convention.
My name is Inspector James O'Neill. You are obstructing pedestrian traffic. I am ordering you to leave this sidewalk. If you do so voluntarily, no charges will be placed against you.
And George Bush and Dick Cheney were running for re-election. And you and Amy Goodman and I went into the Republican National Convention. We got you a credential so that you could go past this massive security apparatus. And we stood on the floor of the Republican National Convention just a few feet away from Dick Cheney. And he spoke that night and gave this very belligerent war speech.
Just as surely as the Nazis during World War II and the Soviets during the Cold War, the enemy we face today is bent on our destruction. As in other times, we are in a war we did not start and have no choice but to win.
And I remember you talking about being in sort of this stadium filled with killers and people egging them on and cheering them on.
I actually, don't know what to say because it's a bit like being in a cult, a place where there's some kind of chanting which veered between chilling and corny. So I'm still confused about which one it was, but I'm sure it was actually chilling because to be in a place which is where the richest and most powerful people in the world meet to plot the next war, the next massacre, the next bombing.
Your reflection on where we are now versus where we were at that moment when you and Dick Cheney were in the same room.
Me and Dick Cheney. Obviously, on the face of it, your president is somebody who is managing to confuse everybody in the establishment, including the Republicans themselves, But ultimately, I still am waiting to see whether it is, in fact, an empire on the wane or not. Because there is a white nations agenda, isn't there, in the world? I mean, Europe and America eventually will hold together, and they today are the biggest merchants of death. We are doing the buying and they are doing the selling of all the weapons. And that is the fundamental strength of the economy now. So there can't be peace on earth when just to keep these economies going, you need to be at war. Since 9/11, how many countries have been destroyed? And all of us keep talking about this fundamental Islam, but when you look at the countries that have been destroyed, none of them were really fundamentalist Islamic states, Those ones are, of course, your allies. Like a lot of people like to compare Trump to Modi. But to me, Trump is like someone who has grown out of the toxic effluent of a system that went very wrong, But I see that every elite American institution is against Trump. The media is against him. The military is suspicious of him. The economists are suspicious of him. The White House itself is suspicious of him. So it's blundering around there. But nobody knows what to do because you don't have any system in place to deal with a lunatic in the White House. So you don't know what to do. But in the case of India, Modi is very much the deep state. He is a product of planning from 1925 for this moment when they're almost there, when they can change the Indian constitution, call it a Hindu nation. So you have a situation here, which is the opposite, where the army, the corporates, the media, the elite, everybody has been supporting him. Everything is just frozen, and continuously this venom is being dripped into people's veins about India should be a Hindu country, and Muslims should be ghettoized, Dalits should be disenfranchised in some way. There's an attack on institutions. The history books are being written by complete cretins. So what's going to happen to the next generation? They will be unable to think unless they find non-formal ways of going to school and college,
As we wrap up, I wanted to ask you about something that you said years ago that I actually think about often, and it deals with the, I think, moral challenge that we often find ourselves in, people who believe in justice, and that is that, we don't have an ability or even a moral authority to choose the form of resistance that rises up in response to the crimes of the imperial nations around the world. And it was during the Iraq War, and really as the Iraqi armed resistance started to really take a toll on the U.S. occupation. And you said the following: you support the resistance, but you may not support the vision that they're fighting for. And I keep saying I'm doomed to fight on the side of people that have no space for me in their social imagination. And I would probably be the first person that was strung up if they won. But the point is that they're the ones that are resisting on the ground, and they have to be supported because what is happening is unbelievable. I recently was thinking about this in the context of what is happening in Syria and Iraq and in Palestine, where the Israelis just
Kashmir
committed another massacre, and in Kashmir, and then historically the genocidal campaigns against the Kurds. Are there any forces of resistance that are worth your support right now in any of these conflicts? I mean, I'm against what the United States and Russia and all of these powerful nations are doing in Syria. At the same time, who is the resistance in Syria? And I don't mean Arundhati explained the different factions.
But honestly, Jeremy, I don't think that the way to resist this is for me or you to go to Syria and support some faction or the other, because the problem is at your home. The problem is to take it down there in the United States or to take it down here in India. I'm anyway obviously deeply entrenched here and deeply grounded here. And here, certainly, there are many, many, many people and many organizations and many ways in which the resistance that is being raised is wonderful, But my issues, let's say, when I think about something like Kashmir, is that it's not my business to think necessarily about what kind of Kashmir is being fought for. But it's certainly my business as somebody in whose name this violence is perpetrated to stand up and say it as it is. We need to do it in the places where things are being done. It doesn't help for you to go to Syria. It helps for you to be where you are and to prevent that from happening in whatever way you can. For me, I need to know the place where I stand and why I stand there.
Well, I think that's a really great note to end on. Arundhati Roy, thank you so much for talking with me.
You're welcome, Jeremy.
Arundhati Roy is the author of 2 novels. Her first, The God of Small Things, won the Man Booker Prize. Her new novel is called The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. Both of them are beautiful, deep, powerful books that I highly recommend. If you want to catch Arundhati Roy when she's here in the U.S., you can find a list of her events by going to roamagency.com/Roy. That's Rome, ROAM, as in roaming the planet, roamagency.com/Roy.